Billionaire mocked Maid's daughter for just checking her balance. That was how the moment began. Sharp, loud, and cruel enough to turn heads inside the marble-bright lobby of the Whitby Tower in downtown Boston. Emily Carter stood there holding her worn transit card, the one loaded with exactly $4.25, and every word he threw at her cut deeper than the amount ever could. Laughter rose from people who had never counted a dollar twice in their lives. Emily didn't move. She didn't answer. She only stared ahead, steady, until something shifted in the crowd, something no one expected. Before we start, tell us from which city are you watching from, and don't forget to drop your thoughts at the end. Enjoy the story. Emily Carter had grown up on the east side of Baltimore, in a narrow brick row house where every surface carried a story of being used, cleaned, repaired, and used again. Her mother, Margaret, worked long hours as a housekeeper for wealthier families, and Emily often helped when school allowed. She learned early that nothing in their world appeared without effort. Every meal, every bus ride, every bill, each one demanded calculation. That was why she kept her numbers precise, her choices deliberate, and her pride intact. She was 24 now, working part-time cleaning office suites in Boston while finishing her last community college credits. Most mornings began before sunrise, with the smell of instant coffee and the familiar scrape of her mother's notes reminding her not to shrink herself for anyone. Emily believed in moving quietly but firmly, doing her work without complaint, and never asking for what she hadn't earned. It was a simple creed, but it held her steady. Across the city, in Back Bay, Harrison Whitby lived a life that Emily only saw in glimpses. Polished stone floors, private elevators, winter coats that cost more than her monthly rent. She didn't dislike people like him. She simply knew their world was built on layers she would never touch. Her job cleaning the executive floors of the Whitby Tower was temporary, a grid she hoped would lead to something better. She kept her head down, learned names, memorized schedules, and stayed unnoticed. What she didn't know was that a routine stop in that same building would place her directly in the center of a moment she never asked for. A moment that would test her pride, her patience, and the belief she had carried since childhood. And as the day began, she had no idea who would be watching when everything turned. The opportunity appeared on a plain white notice taped to the breakroom wall of the Whitby Tower's maintenance floor. Emily had finished wiping down a conference room when she saw it. A temporary staff call for that evening's investor reception on the 38th floor. Double pay, short shift, limited spots. To most people in that building, it was nothing. To Emily, it was one evening that could catch her up on a late utility bill and still leave enough to stretch her food budget into the next week. She stood there a moment, weighing her options, feeling the familiar tug of practicality. It meant finishing her morning shift, rushing home on the bus, changing quickly, and coming right back downtown. Exhausting, yes, but doable. She signed her name before she could talk herself out of it. Back home, she swapped out her work shirt for a plain black blouse, pressed as neatly as she could manage. She smoothed the collar twice, checked for stray lint, and tucked her transit card into her jacket pocket. The balance wasn't much, but it was enough to get her to the tower and back if she timed her transfers right. The ride into the city felt different that evening. The bus windows fogged with the cold, the streetlights flickered across the pavement, and the air held that sharp, metallic winter scent that made everything seem more serious. Emily watched the skyline rise as the bus approached downtown, telling herself the extra shift would be simple. Show up, do the job, stay invisible. But when she stepped into the tower's main lobby, brighter, louder, fuller than she had ever seen it. She realized this wasn't a typical event. Guests poured in, dressed in tailored suits and shimmering dresses, laughter echoing off stone walls. Staff rushed past her, already overwhelmed. Emily squared her shoulders, clutching her work badge. She didn't know it yet, but the opportunity she had reached for was about to tilt into something far more complicated. Emily checked in with the event supervisor, received a quick rundown of her tasks, and was sent toward the service area near the reception hall. Everything moved quickly, glasses being lined up, trays lifted, last-minute instructions tossed over shoulders. She focused on her work, steady and quiet, until a staff coordinator tapped her elbow. "You need to update your access pass for this floor," he said. "Machines in the main lobby. Should take a minute." Emily nodded. It was routine. She stepped away from the service corridor and into the roaring lobby, weaving between arriving guests until she reached the small security kiosk in the corner. The machine required workers to verify identity and confirm their shift by checking their transit-linked employment account. A simple balance check, nothing unusual. She slid her worn transit card into the slot. Before she could type her PIN, a voice behind her rang out. Sharp, amused, undeniably privileged. "You're kidding. You came all the way up here to check your balance?" Laughter followed, sudden and unfiltered. Emily didn't turn. She didn't need to. She recognized the tone. Someone who had never once worried about what remained on a card. Someone who had never stood at a machine hoping the number didn't blink to zero. "I mean, seriously?" the voice continued, louder now. "This is an investor event, not a subway station." A group of young executives clustered beside him, their coats draped over their arms, their eyes flicking toward Emily with mild curiosity and growing entertainment. One of them whispered something that drew another round of laughter. Emily kept her hands on the keypad. Her breath tightened, but her posture stayed still. "I just want to see it," the man said, stepping closer. "What are we talking? A couple dollars? Maybe 3? More laughter, harsh, thoughtless. The number blinked onto the machine. $4.25. Emily felt the heat crawl slowly up her neck. But she didn't move. She didn't give them the satisfaction of a reaction. The man whistled softly. "Wow, $4. You should frame it." Someone snapped a photo. Someone else added, "Maybe we should start a collection jar." Emily pressed the confirmation key, waiting for the machine to release her card, wishing only to step away with what remained of her dignity. But the crowd wasn't finished. One voice she hadn't heard yet cut in, sharper, colder, familiar to many in that building. "Leave her. She's holding up the line." The words weren't just dismissive. They were final, delivered with the authority of someone used to being obeyed, rehearsing the polite half-sentences expected of him. But the sudden burst of laughter near the kiosk caught his attention. It wasn't the cheerful, harmless kind that drifted through events like this, a temporary event worker. But it was her posture that held him still, straight back, shoulders squared, both hands resting lightly on the machine, as if holding herself steady from the inside out. She didn't shrink, didn't argue, didn't give the crowd what they wanted. She only stood, waiting for the machine to release the battered card they found so amusing. Harrison had seen people humiliated before, too often, in rooms like this. He usually ignored it, the way he'd been taught. Keep moving, avoid involvement. Never let something small derail the evening. Yet something about this scene refused to let him walk away. Then he heard it. $4. You should frame it. The crowd laughed again. And for reasons he couldn't explain, Harrison felt something twist in his chest. Not pity, not guilt, but recognition. Because he knew better than most people thought. He had grown up watching his father make jokes exactly like that, sometimes at employees' expense, sometimes at Harrison's, always small, always sharp, always intended to remind the room where the power sat. His gaze dropped to the machine's display for a fragment of a second. $4.25. So that was the great offense. Not incompetence, not wrongdoing, just a small number in a rich room. He found himself staring longer than he should have. Emily didn't look up, but he noticed the stillness in her jaw, the kind that said a person was holding something in place so it didn't break. The young executives continued their performance. Someone added, "She's slowing everyone down." Another chimed in, "Maybe we should donate her a subway ride." Harrison's father's business partners were drifting closer, drawn by the noise. He could already imagine the way they'd tell the story later, twisting it into something clever. He didn't want to hear it. Not again. His voice came out sharper than intended when he finally spoke. "Leave her. She's holding up the line." Emily slid the transit card from the machine and turned to leave, hoping the moment would dissolve behind her. But the echo of those laughs followed like a shadow. She kept her head level, steps measured, eyes fixed on the service hallway ahead. Before she reached it, Harrison cut across her path. "Just a second," he said quietly. She stopped, not because of his tone, but because several members of the crowd had trailed behind him, curious to see what would happen next. Their attention pressed in from every angle. Emily forced her hands to remain steady at her sides. Harrison glanced back at the group, then at her, then back again, an unspoken calculation moving through his expression. "That was unnecessary," he said, projecting his voice so the others could hear. She was doing exactly what the staff is required to do. If anyone held up the process, it wasn't her. The lobby shifted, a subtle ripple. A few people straightened, uncomfortable. A couple scoffed under their breath. The man who started the mockery folded his arms, trying to look unfazed. Emily's throat tightened. She had not asked for defense. She especially had not asked for it from someone who carried the Whitby name. She murmured, "Please don't," but her voice was too soft to compete with the sudden quiet. Harrison stepped slightly to the side, not blocking her, but shielding her from the circle of attention. "If you have a problem," he told the group evenly, "bring it to me, not to someone doing their job." The man who had mocked her opened his mouth as if to argue, then closed it when he realized more guests were watching. Reputation mattered here. Optics mattered. A challenge in front of Harrison Whitby was not worth the risk. Emily didn't thank him. She didn't trust the moment. Instead, she walked past him with her card gripped tight, determined to get back to work. But as she stepped into the service corridor, she could feel it. Something in the building had shifted. The kind of shift that didn't end with a simple walk away. Emily made it through the rest of her shift with rigid focus, refusing to let the humiliation alter her pace. When the final tray was set down and guests began drifting toward the elevators, she slipped into the staff locker room. She hoped for silence. Instead, she found her mother waiting on the bench, still in her housekeeping uniform from another building nearby. Worry etched across her face. "I heard what happened," Margaret said, her voice low but firm. "Someone from the lobby staff called me." Emily closed her eyes. "It was nothing." "It was not nothing," Margaret countered. "They laughed at you. In public. You don't let people do that. Not ever." Emily shook her head. Standing up to them would have made it worse. "I just wanted to finish the shift." Margaret leaned forward, hands clasped. There is dignity in quiet, but there is also dignity in refusing to be stepped on. You know the difference. Her tone carried years of experience, surviving rooms like these, rooms where she cleaned silently while overhearing conversations that were never meant for her. Emily said nothing. The moment replayed in her mind, the laughter, the number on the machine, the feeling of being treated as an inconvenience. She swallowed hard. I did what I could. You did, Margaret admitted, but do not shrink yourself, Emily. Not for them, not for anyone. She touched her daughter's arm, a gesture of both comfort and challenge. Across the city, in his father's office high above Back Bay, Harrison faced a different kind of confrontation. Arthur Whitby stood behind his desk, hands pressed flat against polished wood. I heard you involved yourself in a staff issue, he said, in front of investors. Completely unacceptable. It wasn't a staff issue, Harrison replied. It was basic decency. Arthur's jaw tightened. Your role is to maintain order, not to rescue workers who cannot manage their own duties. Do you understand what this looks like? Weakness, distraction, emotional thinking. Harrison felt the familiar burn in his chest, the same one from the lobby. It looked like a room that forgot how to treat people. That is not your concern, Arthur snapped. But it was. And for the first time in a long time, Harrison refused to look away. Neither Emily nor Harrison knew it yet, but both confrontations had just locked their paths together for what came next. Emily left the building long after the event ended, the cold Boston air biting her cheeks as she stepped onto the quiet street. The city lights blurred in the distance, reflecting off damp pavement. She gripped her transit card in her pocket, the edges worn soft from years of use. That tiny number, $4.25, echoed in her mind, not because she was ashamed of it, but because of how easily others had turned it into a spectacle. She walked to the bus stop and sank onto the metal bench. For the first time all evening, her breath shook. Not from sadness, from exhaustion, from holding herself together, from refusing to let strangers decide her worth. She barely noticed footsteps approaching until a shadow paused in front of her. Are you okay? Harrison asked. Emily stiffened, not looking at him. I'm waiting for my bus. I know, he said quietly. I just wanted to check on you. She let out a soft, humorless breath. You already did enough. His brow tightened. I didn't mean to embarrass you. You didn't embarrass me, she said, finally turning toward him. They did. You just stepped into the middle of it. She paused. But you don't need to fix anything. I'm fine. Harrison studied her carefully. In the bright lobby, surrounded by wealth and noise, she had seemed untouchable. Here, under a flickering street lamp, she looked exactly like someone carrying too much on her shoulders. Still proud, still steady, but tired in a way he recognized. I wasn't trying to fix you, he said. I was trying to stop them. Emily looked away again. People like them don't stop. Not because someone tells them to. Not even because it's the right thing. They stop when it costs them something. And tonight, nothing cost them anything. Harrison felt the sting of that truth. He thought of his father's reprimand, the investors' raised eyebrows. He had been warned to stay in line, not to invite scrutiny, not to be emotional. Maybe that was why this mattered more than it should have. He sat down on the bench, leaving space between them. I'm not asking you to forgive me for getting involved, but I'm not going to pretend I didn't see what happened, and I'm not forgetting it. Emily frowned slightly. Why? It doesn't affect your life. Maybe it should, he said. Silence settled between them. A bus rumbled in the distance, but wasn't hers. Emily tapped her fingers against her knee, thinking. You don't have to follow this any further, she said. Walking away is easier. Harrison nodded. It is. Then, after a moment. But easier isn't always right. She didn't respond, but something in her expression shifted. Not trust, not agreement, but recognition. She saw he meant the words, even if she didn't know what he planned to do with them. Her bus turned the corner. She stood, tightening her grip on her jacket. Good night, she said simply. Harrison rose too, hands in his pockets. "Good night, Emily." She boarded the bus without looking back. But as the doors closed and the engine groaned, both of them knew this wasn't finished. They had stepped into something neither of them could walk away from. Something waiting on the other side of tomorrow. The next morning, Emily arrived at work expecting nothing but silence. Instead, a notice waited in her inbox. All temporary event staff were required to attend a follow-up review meeting. Documentation, verification of duties, and incident reporting. Standard procedure, the email claimed. But the meeting location was unusual. The executive conference room on the 29th floor. Emily's stomach tightened. That floor was far above the areas support staff typically entered. When she arrived, the surprise deepened. Harrison was already there. He stood near the long conference table, a stack of forms beside him. "You're here for the review?" he asked. She kept her tone neutral. "I go where I'm told." "You weren't told," he said. "I requested you." Emily froze. "Why?" "Because security flagged the lobby incident," he explained. "And they want statements from both sides. I didn't want you walking into that alone." She exhaled slowly, weighing whether to believe him. But the room itself told a story. Too many chairs for a simple deposition. Printouts arranged in careful rows. A list of attendees that included mid-level directors and HR officials. Someone was trying to turn last night into a problem. Over the next hour, they were required to go through every detail of the event, not just the confrontation, everything. Where Emily stood, what her task was, which supervisor sent her to the kiosk. Harrison sat beside her the entire time, filling in parts only he could verify. Where the executives had been standing, who made the comments, which guests reacted. At first, they spoke in clipped, formal tones. But as the questions grew more pointed, their answers began to align. Simple, factual, steady. A quiet rhythm formed between them, each reinforcing the other when details were challenged or twisted. By the end, something unexpected had settled in the room. Credibility. Not from power, but from consistency. As they signed the final page, Emily glanced at Harrison. "You didn't have to stay." "I know," he said. He met her eyes, not as rescuer, not as heir, but as someone standing on the same side of a line he hadn't realized existed until last night. And that unspoken acknowledgement was the first real shift between them. The review meeting should have ended there. But one of the HR directors lingered after the others left. She gathered the papers too quickly, avoiding Emily's eyes while offering Harrison a thin, professionally polite smile. "We'll handle it from here," she said. "No further action is needed from either of you." But as she walked out, a single folder slipped from her stack and landed on the table. Harrison picked it up automatically, then paused. Emily noticed the shift in his expression. "What is it?" He opened the folder just enough for her to see. It wasn't an incident report, it was a list. Names, payroll IDs, categories of non-essential staff, and a line item proposal labeled Cost Efficiency Review. Quen staffing reductions. Emily scanned it quickly. Her name was there. So were others she recognized from the maintenance floor. People who depended on every shift. People who didn't have savings or safety nets. "This isn't about the lobby," she whispered. "This was already planned." Harrison leaned closer, lowering his voice. "My father's department has been preparing cuts. They needed an excuse to accelerate it. Last night gave them one. Period." A cold clarity settled over Emily. It wasn't just humiliation. It wasn't just mockery. It was a system waiting for a reason to remove the people it already undervalued. And the ones making the cuts, she said slowly, are the same people who laughed at me. He didn't deny it. For the first time, she saw the cage around him, too. Not made of money or privilege, but of expectations and decisions he had never been allowed to question. He was trapped in a different way, forced to uphold structures he didn't agree with. "So this is what you meant," she murmured, "about seeing things you can't ignore." Harrison closed the folder. "If they use last night to justify this, they'll hurt a lot more people than you. And you'll get blamed for interfering," she added. "Probably," he admitted. They exchanged a long, steady look, quiet understanding settling between them. Different worlds, same truth. Neither of them could pretend anymore. Something needed to be exposed, and they would have to do it together. The quarterly investor briefing was not where Emily expected to be. Yet there she stood at the back of the 42nd floor conference hall, the folder from HR clutched tightly in her hand. Harrison had insisted she come, not as staff, but as a witness. He had already taken the first risk by placing her name on the visitor list. Doing so without his father's approval had consequences he was fully aware of. Rows of polished chairs faced a long stage where Arthur Whitby spoke with the confidence of a man accustomed to obedience. Slides clicked forward, numbers rose, applause followed on cue. Then came the section labeled Operational Efficiency, Personnel. Harrison rose from his front row seat before his father could begin the scripted announcement. "Before we move to staff cuts," he said, loud enough to carry through the room, "there's information that needs to be shared." Arthur's expression froze. "Harrison, not now." "Yes, now." Harrison motioned toward Emily. "Because decisions built on false narratives harm employees and mislead investors." A ripple of confusion moved through the hall. Arthur stepped forward, voice steely. "Sit down." But Harrison didn't. "Last night, staff were publicly humiliated by guests under our company's name. That incident is now being used, not to correct behavior, but to justify terminating workers who had nothing to do with it." Murmurs. Raised eyebrows. Several investors leaned forward. Emily stepped closer, her voice steady. "There was no misconduct. I was completing a required check. Multiple witnesses can confirm this." She held up the folder. "But this," she tapped the staffing reduction list, "was already prepared. The incident was only a convenience." The room shifted. A director whispered urgently into another's ear. Someone scribbled notes. Someone else stiffened. Realizing the optics now unfolding, Arthur's jaw flexed. "This is inappropriate." "What's inappropriate," Harrison replied, "is punishing people for being seen." Silence. Then an investor near the aisle stood. "I want full review before any cuts," he said. Another agreed. A third demanded clarification about workplace conduct standards. Power had flipped, not because someone shouted, but because truth was spoken plainly in front of people who finally had to listen. Arthur stared at his son. Fury held tight behind controlled features, but the decision was made. The cuts were frozen. And for the first time in that building, Emily's voice had carried weight equal to anyone in the room. 2 days later, Emily returned to the same lobby where everything had begun. The marble floors gleamed as always, the fountain hummed steadily, and people hurried past without noticing her. But this time, there was no crowd circling, no laughter pressed against her back, no eyes tracking the balance on her transit card. She approached the kiosk anyway, not because she needed to, because she chose to. She slid the worn card into the slot. The number appeared again, $4.25, the same amount that had sparked the humiliation. The same amount that had revealed something much bigger. But now, it held an entirely different weight. Behind her, a quiet voice said, "You know, you don't have to use that machine anymore. Your employment access was updated." She turned. Harrison stood a few steps back, keeping respectful distance, hands in his pockets. "I know," Emily said, "but I wanted to remember that this is where it turned." He nodded, understanding without prying. A final decision had come down that morning. No terminations, mandatory conduct review for the executives involved, and a formal statement issued acknowledging the misuse of the incident. It wasn't perfect, but it mattered. It meant people kept their jobs. It meant the story had not been rewritten to make her the problem. Harrison held out something small, an unused transit card. Plain, unscuffed. "If you want a fresh one," we said, "no strings attached." Emily looked at it, then at her own worn card. She shook her head softly. "This one works just fine." And she slipped it back into her pocket, walking toward the elevators as the lobby settled around her. This time, with her dignity unshaken, and her place in the building unmistakably her own. Some moments seem small until they pull back the curtain on everything beneath them. For Emily, it was a simple balance check. For Harrison, it was the first time he refused to look away. And for everyone watching, it became proof that dignity is not determined by numbers or status, but by how we choose to stand when others try to shrink us. If this story made you feel something, stay with us. Subscribe to Echoes of Hope. Share your thoughts in the comments and watch the next story waiting for you there.